See. I suppose just before we start, just to acknowledge, obviously, I think we can say Baruch Hashem, the big news that came out last night, and Emir Hashem. I was speaking to people before and correctly pointing out there's no complete solutions to problems, but hopefully this will at least buy Israel's safety for a few more decades, and that's our tefillah that Israel should know only peace. So our focus today is on, and it may be a short show, we'll see how long it takes us. We really have to finish Rashi today. We really have to finish our discussion on Rashi today. And all I really wanted to do today was look at Rashi's views around Pshat, because after all, in a sense, everything else we've been speaking about is a build-up to what brought Rashi to his prominence and his fame, which is, of course, his unique commentary on the Torah. Please remind me, did I last week, we looked at Rashi's philosophical views. We said Rashi wasn't a philosopher in the sense of being someone who systematically formulated a philosophy, but Rashi definitely had a philosophy, and that informed so much of Rashi did. Did I mention the Rambam on Rashi, the letter that the Rambam wrote about Rashi? I think I forgot to mention last year. So this really belongs to the last year, and it's in last week's handout, not in this week's handout. For those watching on YouTube will see the link from last week's handout. There is a letter from the Rambam. I was asked what the Rambam held of Rashi and how come the Rambam didn't meet Rashi and know about Rashi. And the simplest answer to the question is because it just didn't arrive. As Rashi geographically spread, it took time for Rashi to arrive all the way to faraway Egypt. The Rambam's descendants certainly met Rashi, and Rashi's descendants, the Baalei, certainly met the Rambam. So within a generation after Rashi, the Baalei were hearing about the Rambam, fascinated by him, amazed by him, profoundly bothered by him, and all the sort of controversies that then followed. Bothered by the Rambam in the sense that his philosophical ideas bothered them, but amazed by him and this encyclopedic compendium of the Mishnah Torah. And in fact, the Mishnah Torah takes over the Ashkenazi world in the sense of a sort of structured halachic book, to the degree that the Baalei have to attach their psokim to the structure of the Mishnah Torah in order to make sure that their piskei halacha aren't forgotten. But in the opposite direction of travel, Rashi takes over the philosophical world, the rationalist world of Spain, North Africa, and the Middle East. And Rashi is probably one of the most prominent forces for the eventual decline of rational philosophical ways of thinking about Judaism and the rise of more midrashic and mystical ways of thinking about Judaism. You can't really learn Rashi and not think somewhat midrashically. And in terms of style of learning, even the Rambam's descendants, his grandchildren, become influenced very much by the Tosafists. Okay, so the first point briefly to make is that the Rambam probably never met Rashi, never met Rashi, but never heard of Rashi, didn't read his writings. And there are a lot of studies around how Rashi gradually, this ripple effect of Rashi's works gradually spreading and conquering the world. I think I mentioned Eric Lowy, the academic who wrote a work on how Rashi became canonized and how his work spread through the Jewish world and pockets of resistance, and the privilege I had of sitting with this exceptionally lovely man when I was on my sabbatical, and he graciously gave me some time where we met and spoke. There is one document that may suggest that the Rambam was aware of Rashi and didn't like what he was doing, and this is an ethical will that the Rambam wrote for his son. There's the concept of ethical wills are basically letters that great people write to their children in which they give them various instructions. This is published in the collected writings of the Rambam, and it's known. The letter is titled Musa HaRambam Libno Rabbi Avram. The Rambam to his son, Rabbi Avram. I'm just going to mute everyone because we're getting a little bit of interference online. Ethical instruction of I didn't print it on this source sheet, it was on last week's source sheet, and I didn't reprint it to save the trees. The ethical instructions that the Rambam wrote to his son, Rabbi Avram. And in this, it's a very, very lengthy and fascinating letter. But in this letter, he writes that I was very influenced and inspired by Rabbi Avram ibn Ezra. Very interesting comment. We discussed, I think we only gave one share on Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra when I was back briefly for my sabbatical. I think it was just a one-off. Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra wrote a commentary on the Torah that in some ways you could say was the main rival for Rashi, could have become the main rival for Rashi as the standard commentary. It's a flowing commentary on the Torah. It's more Peshat based than Rashi. In a few minutes we'll look at what Rashi means by Peshat, but he has less allegiance to Chazal, and we have to understand what that means. He's an Orthodox Jew. He accepts Talmudic halacha, but when it comes to commentary, he allows himself to learn Pesukim differently to Chazal, and it could have, in theory, become the standard commentary on the Torah, and it didn't. Rashi conquered all. Why did Rashi conquer all? We discussed this in previous weeks. Lots of reasons. But something unique about Rashi, the fascinating work of Rashi, how somehow he weaves Medrash and Pshat, and Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra is maybe too dry and too Pshat based, and it doesn't give you enough sort of tangible, meaty material to grab onto and to really understand. Rashi gets this beautiful blend in which it's Peshat based enough that we can read it in the Pesukim, but also inspires and sparks the imagination in the way that Medrash does, and Medrash adds narrative and poetry and metaphor to the Torah. Also, Rashi has this magical, he finds the Goldilocks zone, in which he's neither so short and terse that you just don't really know what he's saying, nor so long and verbose that it becomes a struggle to read. Long commentaries, most people just don't have the time for. Overly short commentaries, they're just so cryptic that you don't know what they're saying, and Ibn Ezra is cryptic, if anyone is. He's deliberately cryptic at places. But the Rambam writes in his letter to his son that I found that Ibn Ezra very, very inspiring and triggered a lot of thoughts in my mind. Ibn Ezra he was a philosopher. As I mentioned when I spoke about Ibn Ezra, it's hard to call him a great philosopher. He definitely is a philosopher, an amazing commentary on the Torah, enormously rich and creative mind, triggers vast amounts of thought. But he's not a great philosopher in the sense that you see this sort of earth-shattering new way of thinking about things that maybe the Rambam did and other philosophers do. But the Rambam in this letter says that he found him very interesting and inspiring. It's also interesting that Ibn Ezra, and this brings out how hard it is to sort of stick to categories, modern categories of rationalist or philosophical, that Ibn Ezra believes in astrology. He's an astronomer, which is a branch of science, and he's also an astrologer. He believes that the stars and the planets have effects on human affairs, which nowadays we would label as mystical and arguably nonsensical. But Ibn Ezra is a scientist. He's a philosopher. He's a rationalist. But how do you know rationally that astrology doesn't work? I mean, maybe the stars do have some effects on human affairs. So it brings out how hard it is to be a rationalist and actually keep up to date with, know what scientific. The Rambam rejects astrology completely. The Rambam says in his famous letter to the Chachmei Montpellier, it is true, who asked him, how can you reject astrology? Surely Chazal believed in astrology. And he says, not true, not all Chazal did believe in astrology, some did, some didn't, and therefore entitled to Paskin. And then his very famous line, that he says the majority didn't believe in it. And then his very, very famous line, anyway, humans are created with eyes in the front of their heads, not in the back of their heads, because we need to look forward, not backwards. And sometimes human insight moves forward and on things, and just because in ancient times people believe this doesn't mean that we are bound by believing this. The Ibn Ezra does believe in astrology. Nonetheless, at least according to this letter, the Rambam was inspired by the Ibn Ezra. And he says, and I only found the Ibn Ezra after I'd written my major works. Had I written my major works after discovering the Ibn Ezra and his secrets, I would have changed what I said. He would have had impact on what I wrote. Then he says, guard yourself, don't hassle and remove the purity of your refined mind and your precious soul, only with our works and Ibn Ezra's works, but definitely don't learn the French works. Because the French are Francasia, this is France, etc. He says they don't recognize God. They eat food, and that corrodes their clear thinking. They don't understand the philosophical truths, and all they learn really is Talmud. They learn Gemara, endlessly, but they don't understand philosophy, etc., etc. So here he's taking a dig at the French sages, and perhaps at their commentaries on the Torah, which may be referring to Rashi. So this is interesting. It's an amazing letter. It's astounding in the sharpness of his critique. I actually slightly censored it because I can't even bring myself to completely read it. Have a look at last week's handout, and you'll see what he says is quite astounding. The big question is, though, did the Rambam actually write this letter? And the answer is we don't know. Gut feeling as a non-expert, so take it or leave it, no, I don't think the Rambam wrote this letter. And the reason I don't think he wrote this letter isn't because of his digs at the French rabbis, which he wouldn't have liked Rashi and Tosafot. I don't think we have to speculate. He wouldn't have understood what they were saying and doing, and he would have disagreed with them. Whether he would have written quite as strongly as he did, I'm not really aware of the Rambam elsewhere writing in that way, so it doesn't look like his style. But I think there's another agenda in the letter. And I think that agenda is raising the Ibn Ezra's secrets. Because what are the secrets of the Ibn Ezra? The Ibn Ezra had a secret reading of the Torah based on astrology. And here you have the Rambam writing, if I had seen the Ibn Ezra before I wrote my commentary and my Moreh Nevuchim and everything else, I would have changed what I said if I'd seen the Ibn Ezra and his secrets. So I think this letter is, unless we take the letter at face value, that the Rambam is saying, actually, the Ibn Ezra's convinced me to believe in astrology. No way. What are the sodas of the Ibn Ezra? Ibn Ezra has a number of secrets, so maybe he's referring to other secrets of the Ibn Ezra, but the bulk of the Ibn Ezra's secrets are, in other words, Ibn Ezra has ideas that he thinks are only for deep thinkers. A secret doesn't mean he's trying to cover it up. It means it's only for deep thinkers, it's not for everyone, and therefore I'm just going to allude to it, and those that understand these things understand these things. He has a number of secrets. We mentioned one of his secrets. He has secrets in which he thinks that certain psukim perhaps came from post-Mosaic authorship and so on. Very, very complicated matter. I don't want to go through that again, listen to the recording. But Ibn Ezra, one of his big secrets is that a lot of the Torah is built around astrology. So when the Rambam's talking about the secrets of Ibn Ezra, he can't write that unless, if he's really seen Ibn Ezra's writings, he's aware that a bulk of the Ibn Ezra's secrets are around astrology. And the idea that the Rambam at the end of his life is saying, you know what, everything I wrote anti-astrology is wrong. And that's the only way I can read this letter, to me, is extraordinary in the extreme. I find it very, very hard to believe that either this letter came to the Rambam or the whole letter came to the Rambam. Maybe others added into it. And we know that everyone was interested in capturing the Rambam's legacy. Right? You know, obviously everyone is bothered by the Rambam. The Rambam is very dismissive of Kabbalah, he's very dismissive of astrology, and all sorts of other things. And that's a problem, because the Rambam is revered, his Mishnah Torah is just astounding. And what do you do when the Rambam is getting to? So we have reports of end-of-life conversion by the Rambam, as it were, to different philosophical systems. So couple of hundred years after the Rambam died, there's followers of the Kabbalah who are saying at the end of his life, the Rambam met Kabbalah and he learned Kabbalah, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu blessed him that his eyes should be open to Kabbalah, and he accepted Kabbalah in his life, and so on and so forth. So we know that it's very helpful if we can argue that, okay, the Moreh Nevuchim was what the Rambam thought when he was younger, but at the end of his life he changed his mind. So to me it looks like this letter writer has an agenda against the French rabbis, who are certainly opponents of the Ibn Ezra, but he also has an agenda to say, look, we have these two great rationalists, the Rambam and the Ibn Ezra, they're so similar, what a pity that they can't be identical. And they're not identical, even great thinkers don't think the same way. And the Rambam is saying, so does the Ibn Ezra actually, after I saw them, they're really good, and I wish I would have met them earlier in my life and had to change what's written. I can only say it remains a running debate, take it or leave it. I'm certainly far from being an expert. I haven't seen anyone make this point, though. Everyone gets very excited about the attack on Rashi. I haven't seen anyone make the point that there's something else happening here. There's an attack on the French way of learning, maybe Rashi, but there's also an elevation of the Ibn Ezra, and not just the Ibn Ezra as a commentary, which I can live with. I may have been very, very impressed by the Ibn Ezra's general commentary with his focus on Pshat and Diktuk in many ways, and rationalism. In many ways, it does align with the Rambam's thinking. But when he mentions the secrets of the Ibn Ezra, even though famously everyone talks about one secret of the Ibn Ezra, his thoughts about maybe there was the apostle here and there that's post-Mosaic, the bulk of the Ibn Ezra secrets are astrology, and I don't believe that the Rambam casually changed his mind about that and mentions this in the letter, and therefore I struggle to take the letter at face value and believe that it's wholly authentic. Okay, so that tidies up the end of last year, which was about Rashi's philosophy in general. What I want to focus on in the time remaining today is Rashi's views around Pshat. Now, defining Peshat, or the so-called simplest explanation of the Pasuk, isn't simple at all, isn't easy at all. It's one of these slippery concepts, because every text needs interpretation. And as soon as you're interpreting, you're translating things into your own way of thinking, and by definition, you're adding something to the text. If you're adding nothing to the text, then there's no commentary. By definition, all commentary is interpretation, all translation is interpretation. Even when Rashi simply translates a word and says this is the translation of the word in Aramaic or the translation of the word into French, there's interpretation going on. This is known by everyone. The Rambam, when he writes to his translators, because the Rambam wrote in Arabic and the provincial scholars are translating, and when they write back to him, they're aware that translation is interpreting. Languages flow differently when you're translating from Arabic, which is or Hebrew into a European language. You have to restructure the whole sentence structure. You can never translate without interpreting. You can never comment without interpreting. Otherwise, what's the point of a commentary? If Rashi is going to literally just stick to the pasuk, then there's no translation, no interpretation. Then it's not a commentary at all. So you're always interpreting. So you're adding something into the text to make it coherent and to make it understandable to the reader, to the observer. On some way, you have to be doing that. So the idea that somehow Pshat is sticking to the literal reading and Medrash is adding things in is a little too simplistic. You're always adding something into the pasuk. So I think we gave a series on Pshat and Medrash when I looked at this at length. In some way or others, it's probably not helpful to think about these concepts as digital, on off. Either it's Medrashic or it's Pshat. It's probably more helpful to think of this as a spectrum concept in which on one end you have more of an adherence to the simplest translation of the text, and on the other end you have more willingness to add in extra interpretive elements. But it's hard. It's not an easy thing to sort of define exactly when Pshat morphs into Medrash and Medrash morphs into Pshat. It's well known that maybe I'll just mention one word about Medrash, which is in modern academic terms, we divide Medrash into two things, into what we call Agadic Medrash, or philosophical and narrative Medrash, and Halachic Medrash, Midrashei Halacha. That division exists already in the times of Chazal, but it's never quite articulated that way till modernity. You have, for example, something like the Medrash Rabbah, which is largely extra stories and extra narratives and miracles that we're not told about and the like. And then you have Torah's Kohanim and Sifra and Sifri, which are halachic Medrash, in which they interpret the Pesukim and draw out halachas. Both of them are finding significant extra detail that isn't mentioned in the Pasuk. So if we had to sort of begin formulating what Medrash is, we'd say something like buying in more to the idea that texts are somewhat symbolic and cryptic. In other words, Pshat would say, we want the text to tell us basically most of what we need to know, or everything that we need to know. But obviously there's a certain amount of background. I said there's no such thing as pure Pshat. There's always a bit of background information you have to give, particularly when you're talking about a text that's 3,500 years ago. And if there's any interpretation, it's always because there's some information missing. But Pshat doesn't want to add in large chunks of information. The idea that a pasuk says Avram left Ur Kasdim, and the translation isn't a location, Ur Kasdim, Ur of the custom of the Chaldeans, but it's Ur, the furnace of the Kasdim, and there's a whole story in which Avram smashed idols, and he's thrown into the fire, and he survives, all that Medrash. The idea that there's this whole massive chunk of information missed out is drifting away from Pshat, is more towards Medrash, but even Pshat adds some information into it. But the idea that texts are cryptic, that they need more information added into them, the idea that they can be read symbolically, even without clues like that, all of this is sort of moving one towards Midrashic. The idea that texts are prophetic and homiletic, in other words, that they may ostensibly be talking about a story now, but they're also alluding to events that maybe will happen in hundreds of years' time or thousands of years' time. Texts are consistent, both Pshat and Medrash agrees that texts have to be consistent, but Pshat will try and achieve a consistency in the locality. The story has to read in a narrative way, in a readable way. Whereas Drush will look at contradiction between different sections of the Torah and again try and draw out completely new information from it. It's not, by the way, just Medrash, sort of what we call Medrash, which is narrative Medrash, which adds in massive details. It's halachic Medrash that adds in massive details. You have the same halacha, brought in Parshas Shoftim and in Parshas Mishpatim, and the resolution is one is talking about one type of guardian, and the other one's talking about another type of guardian, one's talking about one type of slave, and another one's talking about a different type of slave, or whatever we're doing. The halachic Medrash is also adding in layers of halachic detail that in the text you wouldn't automatically see, but that's what it means to interpret a text halachically. So somewhere along that line is where the spectrum is shifting. Pshat is trying to get more local reading. It doesn't want to take one pasuk and give a beautiful explanation of that pasuk, but it doesn't seem to fit into the consistency of the whole reading of the psukim. Yesterday in my drasha, I said a piece of medrash, effectively, a modern medrash. And I said, when Moshe says to the Meraglim, take the fruit of the land, it doesn't just mean take this chazak, be strong and take the fruit of the land. It doesn't just mean strong. Why do you have to be strong to take the fruit of the land? Well, Pshat answer is, don't get caught stealing because the fruit is heavy, maybe. But I gave him a drashic reading, be strong, take the fruit of the land, look at the fruit, consider, ponder the fruit of the land, think about the effort that needs to go into making the fruit grow, think about the seed rotting in the ground and germinating and out of this emerging, and so on. That was my drasha on a Shabbos morning, giving a quasi-midrashic reading. But I'm putting something more into the pasuk than it's there if you read the pasuk on face value. It's not always easy to draw the line between the two. In fact, it's very, very difficult. And I'll just mention a few points around this. The Rambam, who clearly is on the side of the Pshat readers, nonetheless is the famous source of reading every reference to Hashem's physicality as ostensible physicality as a metaphor. When it says the eyes of God, it means God's awareness. When it says the outstretched arm of God, it means the power of Hashem, and so on and so forth. Is this more Pshat or more Midrashic reading? Well, in a sense, it's more midrashic, because if you say, look, Pshat just means the simplest reading is the arm of God, the eyes of God. Why am I not willing to accept that simplest reading? Because I have philosophical assumptions that don't make that reading acceptable. Therefore, I'm willing to take the reading out of its literal reading. So if you translate Pshat as literal, in many ways, the Rambam is less literal than perhaps other commentaries. If Rashi, and this is a big if, as per our previous discussion, but if Rashi thinks that you can take these phrases literally, then Rashi is being more Pshat than the Rambam. Rashi is taking it literally, the arms of God, the eyes of God, if that's what Rashi is doing, which I discussed last week. I'm not convinced of, I don't think so. But then Rashi is the one taking more Pshat reading, and the Rambam is taking the more conceptual reading. The Gaonim and the Rambam, who are an Unclus, who are the masters of Pshat, as it were. Maybe we could give a series on Unclus himself. Very, very fascinating individual, great, incredible giant titan of Jewish thought. Again and again, actually translates the pasuk into Aramaic and subtly interprets its meaning. He is no doubt a Baal HaPshat. He's not giving midrashic explanations, and yet not giving midrashic explanations, we have Musa going on over here, not giving midrashic explanations, but nonetheless interpreting the psukim in his own way, in a remarkable way. So what are the borders between Pshat and Medrash? Not simple at all. One of the great scholarly achievements of the 1800s and early 1900s was a swathe of Achronim, Samson Raphael Hirsch, the Malbim, Ksav Kabbalah, the Netziv, the Meshech Chochmah, Torah Tamima. For whatever reason, in that particular era, there was renewed interest in this, who showed how so many halachic midrashim of Chazal are what they called Omek HaPshat, the depth of Pshat. So until the era, on some level or other, when we learned drashas of Chazal, for about 1,500 years, people hadn't really created halachic medrash. And you read the halach drash and you thought, okay, it's something Chazal are doing, but not really Pshat, the simplest reading of the pasuk. They revealed, actually, when you plumb the depth of Pshat, you come out with these readings. So the first point I want to mention is that it's often simplistic to talk about medrash and Pshat. There's often an overlap between the two, or think of it as a spectrum. It's hard to exactly tie down where the border lies. This is point number one. Let me give you one final example before I move to point number two. Rashi has a principle, Ein Muktam U'Me'ucha b'Torah. You can't always assume that things work in a chronological order. Sometimes the narrative can go out of order. It tells us about a scene that took place after another scene. Famously, Yisro. Did Yisro arrive before Matan Torah, after Matan Torah? Well, if you look at the Torah, it seems he arrived before Matan Torah, but perhaps chronologically he arrived after Matan Torah. Again, is that a tool of Pshat or Medrash? Very, very hard to say. On the one hand, it sounds midrashic, it's sort of changing the whole order. On the other hand, there are reasons why, in the Pshat basis, Rashi is doing this, because there's other indications in the pasuk that make things easier to understand that way. And actually, texts do work that way, right? Even Lahavdil, you read a novel will often have flashbacks, often late information will be revealed as earlier. And this is a well-known literary technique, and there's good reasons why why the Torah might change the order of events. So these things are very unclear. Parsh Sefer Bereshis, again, not Sefer Bereshis, the description of the creation of the world. I don't want to deal with a complicated subject too briefly, but there's very strong indications in the Rambam's famous guide to Perplexed and the Moed Nevuchim famously, in which the Rambam may have considered the 7 days of creation as metaphor in 7 eras, or even 7 stages, 7 conceptual stages. is the Rambam being more Peshat than Rashi? Everyone will say Rambam, and the rationalists are more Peshat and the non-rationalists are more Midrashic. But the Rambam, when there's reason for so doing, is very happy to, well, not happy, he'll accept the concept of learning Pesukim, what we would call Midrashically. Any fair reader of the Moreh Nevuchim would say that in many cases he's giving a sort of Midrashic explanation, in the sense that he's taking a Pasuk out of the simplest translation, saying, no, Yom doesn't really mean day. In this context, it means something else, and so on and so forth. So these are slippery concepts. Yeah.
I read that the Moshe said that Korah, it doesn't actually say when it actually happened, when the story happened. And we seem to take what's this is follows the Meraglim, but no, not necessarily.
So the Rishonim talk about this, exactly when was the order of Korah, 100%, yeah. Yeah, and Muktam Melech b'Torah. So what can we say around this? Given all these provisos, that it's very hard to overly define Pshat and Medrash, and we shouldn't think of these as entirely two separate genres. Nonetheless, like many slippery concepts, even though the grey territory is unclear, there are extremes when it becomes very clear this is Pshat and very clear that this is Medrash. What we can broadly say, and here I'll sort of give the punchline away, is that Ibn Ezra, who is not influenced by Rashi, but the descendants of Rashi who are influenced by Rashi definitely take Pshat to a greater extreme. And most famously, the Rashbam, the grandson of Rashi, writes a commentary on the Torah, which is sticks much more closely to literal meaning, cuts out much more extra information, and is therefore considerably further along the Pshat spectrum than Rashi himself. So if, on one end we have Medrash, and on the other end, we have extreme Peshat, where you're really trying to stick to the simplest meaning, trying to add in as little information as you can. There's no such thing as pure Peshat. There's never adding in any information. If Rashi is, 2/3 of the way from Medrash and a third towards Peshat, Rashbam is 95% towards Peshat, and Ibn Ezra is 95% towards Peshat. They become more extreme in their Peshat explanation. That we can say. We can say that though Rashi constantly says, I'm coming to explain Peshat, he is more influenced by Medrash than the next generation of Pashtanim, of those who are trying to read and interpret Peshat. And I want to try and explain what Rashi thought he was doing to the best of my ability when he talks about Peshat. It also seems that in doing what he did, at least in the Ashkenazi world, he allowed the development of more extreme Peshat. And I just want to try and explain my understanding of what Rashi is doing, as opposed to what the Rashbam is doing, and then we'll look at some of the sources inside. To me, it seems that the Rashbam is saying, I'm going to learn Chumash as if it's a new Sefer. In other words, I'm going to ignore, in a very significant way, precedent, how Chazal, how the Midrashim understood the Pesukim, and I'm going to learn what the Pasuk says. I'm going to just read what it says. I'm a master of Tanakh. I know my grammar inside out, of course. You can't just open a Chumash, and just say anything you want. I'm a master of grammar and Hebrew. I'm also a master of the whole of Tanakh. So, of course, I'm going to have to deal with contradictions and the like, because the texts need to be consistent. But basically speaking, I'm going to try, my understanding of Pshat is, I'm going to try and understand within the best of my ability what this means on the simplest level. Does that mean I'll never add anything in? Of course I need to add things in, otherwise I'm not writing commentary. I need to make sense of the text. But I'm going to try and add in minimal information, and I'm going to try and let the text speak for itself and be as consistent as it can. Something like that is a summary of the Rashbam's philosophy of interpretation of Pshat. What happens when that contradicts Chazal? Okay, it contradicts Chazal. How can we live with that? We've spoken about this before, a model of multi-tiered interpretation, which allows one to interpret things on multiple levels. Chazal interpreting on one level, we are interpreting on another level, and we don't have to worry about that. What happens when it contradicts halacha? Even then, I'll learn a pasuk as it seems to say, and I think there's Torah worth in translating that pasuk in that way, even though I know that the sages understood in a different way, and they paskent halacha l'maisa based on their interpretation, not my interpretation. And the most famous example of this, we mentioned, I think, when we were looking at the Ibn Ezra in his famous Igeres HaShabbos, his letter of the Shabbat, is that the Rashbam is happy to translate Vayihi Erev Vayihi Voka. We say that the evening, the Torah day begins in the evening and finishes the next night, which is why Shabbos starts Friday night and finishes on Saturday night. Well, one of the sources for this is Vayihi Erev Vayihi Voka, the seventh day of creation, and indeed the 6 days that preceded it started in the evening. Vayihi Erev Vayihi Voka, it was evening and it was morning, Yom Echad, Yom Sheni, and so on and so forth. The Rashbam translates it as Vayihi Erev Vayihi Voka, meaning there was evening of the last day. Then Vayiboka, it became morning. Now Yom Echad, the first day, has finished. So with morning occurring, the onset of morning, the first day has finished. Meaning to say, the start of the second day is morning. Yom Echad means it was evening and it became morning. Now day one is finished and we're about to start day two. In other words, the day starts in the morning. Conclusion, days start in the morning in Peshuta Shel Mikra. Potentially horrific halachic conclusion that Shabbos starts in the morning and you've lost the whole of Shabbos. The Ibn Ezra famously says, so this is a step too far even for the Ibn Ezra, who's a Baal Pshat. He says, I came to England, he wrote his famous Igeris Shabbos in England, and Shabbos is crying. I saw this commentary, which is outrageous, etc., etc. So the Rashbam didn't keep Shabbos from Friday night till Motzei Shabbos. We know he did. The same Rashbam, is one of the most prominent Baalei Tosafos, who wrote one of the most beautiful and important and profound and influential commentaries on the Gemara. Tosafos commentaries on the Gemara. He's definitely a Talmudic Jew. He's not a closet Karaite or anything like that. He's absolutely adhering to halacha. There's no conspiracy theories out there. We know exactly what he did and how he practiced. He's one of the most influential of the Baalei Tosafos. He has hundreds of Talmidim. He's a Rosh Hashiva. He's definitely keeping normative halachic Judaism. But he doesn't think there's a problem in explaining a pasuk in one way and explaining pshat in Chazal in another way. This is the Rashbam. What opens that sort of Pandora's box? The ability for a human to say, a modern human, meaning a human in the 1100s, 1200s, to say, I'm going to look at the psukim afresh with my own eyes, rather than through just the eyes of Chazal. The answer is the project of the generation before Rashi. And here we come to what Rashi is doing. I think that this is just my own understanding, take it or leave it, and I'm certainly not an expert on these things, but this is my own reading of it. I think when Rashi says, I'm sticking to Peshat, he means something a little different. I think what Rashi is doing is he's going through all the Chazals and all the Medrashim, and he's saying, I'm going to choose the Medrash closest to Peshat. In other words, I'm an adherent of Chazal. I am interpreting the Pesukim as Chazal have taught us to do. But we have a multiplicity of Medrashim out there. I'm going to choose the one that's closest to Chazal. And when there isn't a Chazal, then I'll interpret it the way I understand it. And I think most of the time, Rashi is a midrashic interpreter, and what he means by Peshat is the medrash that most closely fits Peshat in general, and 90% of the time. I'm not saying 100% of the time, but 90% of the time. And what Rashi means is we have the right and the ability, or at least it's worthwhile, there's utility in choosing between this full range of medrash and choosing the medrash that sticks most tightly to Peshat. Now, the point is that whilst that is complete adherence to Chazal, you are opening a can of worms. Because as soon as you say that we can start judging between Chazals, which one we think is closest to Pshat, we're not judging as to which one is correct and which one is truth and which one is inspired. They're all Torah, 100%. Rashi again and again, and we'll see this shortly, emphasizes they're all Torah. But we are judging which ones I want to choose for my commentary and explain the psukim. As soon as you're doing that, you're allowing human reason to weigh up the value in a Peshat scale, not in another scale. They all have infinite value, but in Peshat, we're allowed to weigh up which one we think is closest to Peshat and which one is further from Peshat, and so on and so forth. As soon as you allow that to happen, you're opening this new way of thinking, which is we humans can look at the psukim and we can weigh up what we think they mean. If you can do that, then there can be a next generation project in which we are even willing to move away from Chazal in how we interpret psukim. So to summarize what I'm saying, I think there's been a bit of a category error. People are often puzzled. Rashi again and again says, and we'll see some of the sources inside. I only came to explain the simplest meaning of the psukim. And then Rashi gives midrashic reasons of psukim that seem far from Pshat. Now, again, every time Rashi does that, there's famously what's bothering Rashi. There's a reason Rashi's doing that. There's textual clues. Rashi is the most incredibly nuanced reading. He doesn't need my Askama. An incredibly nuanced reader of text. He's aware of every subtlety of the pasuk. He's coming to smooth it all over for you. He's coming to write a commentary that makes it easy to read the Torah, and he does it with incredible brevity. And that's why we all continue to learn Rashi. We read the psukim and they become so beautiful and so easy to read with Rashi. And yet, he's doing so by selecting midrashim. And therefore, a lot of the time, when the answer he's willing to give to smooth over the pasuk is midrashic. He's open to midrashic answers to psukim, but only when there's a textual reason to do that, when there's a clue, when there's a problem, and then he will select, often, not always, but often, the medrash that he sees as the closest to Peshat. But once you allow yourself to do that, you're already saying, our reading, my little reading in the 1100s as a mere sage in Ashkenaz, far from Chazal, I can read Psukim and weigh up which medrash I think is closer to Pshat. Once you do that, then you're already allowing a new type of reading of Psukim, which paves the way for the much more radical way of reading that the Rashbam embarks on. That's I would say my attempt at summary, and I just want to show a few sources inside in order to bring this out and mention a couple of points. I'll just pause for a minute because I hope what I've said has I hope it's been interesting enough that there's thoughts and reflections on that. Yeah, Avram.
Precedent, and
Yes.
when you get somewhere, the second says, from that, I don't need precedent.
There's a mass. Okay, really important point, and I'll repeat it online for those. I remember saying there's a leap here between I'm accepting precedents, but I'll use my logic to determine which precedents I accept. Between I'll now just use my logic to determine reading. There is a leap, and it's a generational divide. However, even let's say when we think about the classic Derech HaLimud of Gemara, we will never say we think Rava was right and Abaye was wrong, or Beis Hillel was right and Beis Shammai was wrong with the other way around. Halacha l'maaseh, we have to paskin one way or another, which is not too far an analogy to this, but we won't determine a typical Derech HaLimud will say we learn the Gemara and we try and understand the logic of both sides. And who are we to determine which one's right and which one's wrong? Even between the Rishonim, right? When you have an argument between Rashi and Rabbi Tam, we'll try and understand both ways of thinking. Practical halacha, we have to paskin, but we're not weighing up really the merits of either. When it comes to practical halacha, we'll use tools like majority or minhag and various other tools, but we're maybe weighing up the figures that are very close to us. If there's an argument between Moshe Feinstein and Rabbi Eliezer Waldenberg, then maybe we'll weigh it up. But there's an argument between, even Rabbi Kiva and the Chasam Sofer. We're not really going to say one got it right and one got it wrong. There's rare occasions where the Gemara itself will say someone got it wrong, or there's very clear consensus that this was a rare exception. But basically, the use of reason when you're dealing with titans who are epochs beyond one is not obvious. And all I'm saying is that I think that in Rashi opening up the very concept that reason can determine what's the more Peshat-based reading is creating a genre, at least for Ashkenazim, of Peshat has worth. Well, if Peshat has worth and we can use our minds to determine which medrash is closer to Peshat, well, maybe then, and Chazal weren't clearly that engaged in the Peshat because they were happy to do all these different medrashim, then maybe there's a space for us to come up with our own Peshat. That's my suggestion. Again, take it or leave it. I don't want to over-exaggerate it. Rashi does sometimes come up with his own innovative Peshatim here and there, but to me that seems by and large what Rashi means by Peshat. When he says I'm coming to Peshat, means I'm coming to choose the medrashim that are closest to Peshat. And very often there is no medrash. So Rashi is happy to say his own Peshat, but by and large, it seems to me this is what Rashi is doing. But that sets the groundwork for a later development of more extreme Peshat. All I'll do is I'll just point out maybe very, very briefly a few samples of where Rashi says this, and then I want to pause and think how philosophically does Rashi justify this, and then draw this conclusion. Source one in the handout. Oh, I haven't put the link in the of the handout for those who are online. Let me just see if I can find it. Sorry, I apologize for those, and I will put the link also in the sorry, I apologize. Let's hope this works. Okay, this works. I'll just paste it here for those who are online. Okay, I've put the link on for those who want to click on it, who want to follow inside. You don't need to follow inside. I'll read the main quotes, but for those online, I've put the link. Source one. You know what, let's not even go through the pasuk and the context of Rashi. I'll just do the bit that I put in highlight. Rashi gives a certain explanation of what it means. This is a very mystical episode. This is the episode in Gan Eden when Adam and Chava have sinned, and now God confronts them. And there's a very strange pasuk in which it says that they hear the sounds of Hashem walking through the garden. So Hashem is approaching them in the garden. Very, very difficult pasuk to understand. Rashi gives an explanation. He says, Yesh medrashei agato rabim. There are many midrashic interpretations of the pasuk. V'klar sidrum rabbi sein al mechonom, Bereshis Rabbah. Look in Bereshis Rabbah if you want to see all the midrashic interpretations. Or b'shar midrashis, and in other midrashis, V'ani lo basi elav b'shuto shel mikra. I am only coming to explain pshuto shel mikra. Okay, so what's Rashi said so far, if you stop there? There are many midrashic readings of this mysterious pasuk about the sound of God walking through the garden. Look in Medrash if you want to see it. There's already beautifully arranged Midrashim. Look in Medrash Rabbi and elsewhere if you want to see how the Midrashim explains. I'm going to come in to explain Pshutei Shel Mikra. Ula agoda hamiyasheves divri hamikra dova dibur alufanav. Key words. And for the agoda, for the Medrash, which settles the pasuk, each word and each concept in its correct place. So he says over here, I think clearly, there's many midrashim. I am looking for the pshuta shel mikra and for the agoda, which settles the psukim in place. So Rashi isn't rejecting medrash over here. He's saying I'm looking for the medrash that most settles on the settled places. In source 2, he gives a certain explanation. There he says, "V'yesh medrash agoda." There are medrash agoda. Aval ein miyashavim al pshuto. They're not miyashav al pshutim. I couldn't find a medrash there which settled on its place, and therefore I am giving my pure pshat explanation. Look in source 5. I cut out numbers because I gave many examples, and I took them out. Those who are interested, I can give you offline more examples. Source 5 is an interesting one. Look at the end of Rashi, just before source 6. This is near the bottom of page, a third of the way up from the bottom, page 1. So again, we're not going to go through all the context. We don't have time for that. He says, therefore I say, the same phrase as before. I want to settle the pasuk on its pashat, each phrase in its right context. And there's many midrashic reasons. Let the drasha do what it does. Shenema, now he cites a pasuk in Yirmiyah, a very famous pasuk made famous by Rashi. Haloi koi devorai keish ne'um Hashem. My words are like fire, says God. Ukapatish yifot selah, and like a hammer, an anvil smiting a rock. Explains Rashi, mischalekas, dividing the common tzotzos into many sparks. So Rashi has a vision of Torah in which Torah sparks. And like a fire throws out lots of sparks, like an anvil shatters a rock into many fragments and pieces go flying. Similarly, Torah is overwhelming. God's words are like fire. Of course, all we can ever as humans do is grab a particular spark. Says Rashi, I'm grabbing the spark of Peshat, but no way should that indicate that I think the other explanations are less vibrant, are less sparkling, are less fire. There's simply other ways of understanding things. Don't think in what I'm saying I'm delegitimizing the other approaches, because such is Torah. It fragments into many different readings. Now, here Rashi comes to the closest to being a philosopher in a sense, of articulating a philosophy. Rashi comes the closest to meta thinking about what he's doing, sharing with us his metaphors. I mentioned already, Rashi doesn't write a hakdama or an introduction which explains us what he's going to do, but here he is articulating a philosophy of, we would call it as multi-tiered Torah. Rashi doesn't see it as a multi-tiered Torah. We've spoken before about Shat, Remez, Drush, Soid, Shivim, Ponim, in which we've spoken about how we as the listener, there's multiple levels to interpretation. Rashi isn't hearing it as multiple levels. Rashi is hearing it as, what do you think when you're talking about the fire of God's word? All you as a human can ever get is a spark. We're never going to get the whole infinite picture. So by definition, we're only getting a spark. And therefore, I see my job, what I'm coming to do as trying to understand and warm myself by the light and the fire of one particular spark. But of course, there's multitude of other sparks out there which are equally warming. They're just not the sparks that's not the fire that's not the hearth that I choose to sit at. This seems to me what Rashi is articulating over here in terms of the sort of philosophy of learning. I want to jump to source 7, which I added in after having listened to Laning yesterday. This is from in Yonah Zoma from Parshas B'Shalach. There's a reason I put this source in. Two reasons. One is because it brings out how difficult it is to know the difference between Medrash and Peshat. And secondly, because people ask me about whether Rashi is always consistent in how he explains things. And here's an example where Rashi seemingly is inconsistent and explains the same pasuk in different ways in different localities. As I explained last week, we don't know why Rashi was sometimes inconsistent. Rashi is Rashi. He's a giant of a thinker. Is there some subtlety we're missing? Why he explains things differently in different locations? Some clue of language? Is it that Rashi isn't bothered by consistency? Unlike the Rambam, is he not going through his work constantly and trying to make it consistent? Is Rashi changing his mind? Does he think that if anyway I'm seizing sparks, I might as well in one case explain one way and in another case another way, because both sparks indicate a pshat reading? We don't know. But there are cases where, at least on the surface, Rashi doesn't explain the same pasuk twice, and this is an example of this. So have a look at source 7. Here we will look at the pasuk inside. This is from Shalach Lecha. Vayalu b'negev. This is describing the path of the spies. They go up through the south. Vayovar at Chevron, he came to Chevron. By the way, this is the source of the famous Rashi, that he means Kolev. I didn't print this Rashi. Kolev went to Chevron. Why did he go to Chevron? To daven in Kivrei Others. Is that pshat, by the way, or medrash? You have a pasuk that says they went to the south and he went to Chevron. Who's the he? It's Kolev. Why did Kolev go to Chevron? It must be that he's bothered by the spies, and therefore he goes to daven at Moras Machpein and Kivrei Others. I think we would say it's adding a lot into the pasuk. There's no clue to any of this. On the other hand, there's a real problem over here. They went to the south and he went to Chevron. Well, who's he and who's they? So you have to say something to resolve this. So one person, well, who's the most likely candidate of the one person who went? Kolev. So this is a good example. It's clearly midrashic. It's adding a lot into the pasuk. He went to Chevron. There's no clue who the he is. By the way, ask most people, what tell me about Kolev, and they'll all tell you the story. He went to Chevron to daven Moras Machpein. It's not a pasuk. It's a Rashi. Rashi makes midrashim so mainstream. Is this a medrash or a pshat? We have a pshat problem over here. Who's the he? Who's the they? But let's carry on. Then it carries on. There they met the giants, okay. Then it carries on with an aside that we don't understand. Chevron, well, let's translate this. Sheva shonim, 7 years, Nivnasa was built, lifnei Tzoyan Mitzrayim, before Tzoyan and Mitzrayim. Very strange addition. The spies, or Kolev, comes to Chevron. You should know that Chevron was built 7 years before Tzoyan and Mitzrayim. Okay, what is Tzoyan and Mitzrayim? It's this famous town, this famous city, a flourishing civilization. The Jews are about to enter Canaan. You should know we're older than them, right? We existed 7 years. Chevron, our ancient city, existed 7 years before the first city, the ancient city of the Egyptian civilization. We got there first, kind of thing, something like that. Why is it telling us this? Well, maybe in the context of spies trying to explore the beauty of the land of Israel, it wants to tell us that Chevron was built earlier. Some prestige in being older, not clear. Says Rashi, I have a problem, and I don't go into the whole genealogy of this, but basically he says that Israel was given to Canaan, and Egypt was given to Mitzrayim. Who are Mitzrayim and Canaan, the founders of these nations? They are both sons of Chum. Chum has an older son, Mitzrayim, and a younger son, Canaan. And he allocates to them his section of the world. He gives Egypt to the son called Mitzrayim, and he gives Israel, Canaan, to the son called Canaan, who's going to hold it temporarily till the Jews kick the Canaanites out. Okay. Says Rashi, which sort of father builds for his younger son a town ahead of his older son? Surely it makes sense that first he settled Mitzrayim, and then he settled Canaan. So how can we say that Chevron, which is Canaan, is built, precedes Egypt? Very interesting question. Is this bringing in extraneous facts into the psukim? Very hard to know. Rashi sees this as a pshat question. I have a problem. This doesn't make sense. Says Rashi, the correct translation of the pasuk is very different. Correct translation of the pasuk is Chevron is 7 times better than so on. So it's telling us what a wonderful land Eretz Israel is, not because it's 7 years older, that Chevron's 7 years older, but because Chevron, which Rashi points out is the most rocky, barren place in the land of Israel, because that's where you build a cemetery, is 7 times better than Sion, which is the most fertile, beautiful part of Egypt. Now, how does that read in the pasuk? Is that a pshat reading of the pasuk or a midrashic reading of the pasuk? We would say midrashic reading of the pasuk. Except how do we know exactly? I mean, how do you translate pasukim? The Chevron Sheva Shonim Nivna Solif Neitzon Mitzrayim. Before, can before mean, does before only mean chronologically before? Or can it mean precede as in better? It can mean precede as in better. If I say something precedes something else, you can mean it's superior to it. It's not an illegitimate reading. What does Sheva Shonim mean? Does Shonim only mean years? What's the literal meaning of the word Shana? The literal meaning of the word Shana is a cycle, shenit, it's a second. The reason we call a Shana or Shino is a change in Mishnaic Hebrew. A Shana is called a Shana because it's like a repeat, a second time round, a cycle. It means cyclical, something like that. Shana means going around a second time. So Rashi is translating the pasuk as Sheva Shonim Nivna Solif Neitzon Mitzrayim. Chevron Sheva Shonim. Chevron is 7 cycles better, 7 times better than the flourishing of Tzoyan in Mitzrayim. Nivnasa means built. Does built only mean structurally built, or can built mean in terms of development? Can absolutely mean in terms of development. So Rashi is arguing that you can translate this pasuk in Pshuto Shel Mikra as Chevron is 7 cycles, 7 times built better, flourishing better than Tzoyan in Mitzrayim. At this point, we sort of surrender. Is this Peshat or Medrash? What do you do with this? Where do you go with this? It seems so clearly midrashic, bringing in an extraneous question and an unusual reading, and yet it is you can read it in the pasuk, and if you understand how Hebrew works, there are many examples where lifnei means better than. There are rare examples where shana means a cycle. That is the meaning really of year every time. I'm trying to point out that Rashi has a very different conception of what pshat is to what we do, and his willingness. By the way, this isn't Rashi's own pshat, of course. This is a medrash. It's a gemara, actually. It's a midrashic gemara. Rashi is choosing again between midrashim and giving a midrashic interpretation, which he sees as the closest to pshat. Very interesting. This, well, look at the next source in Devarim Yud Aleph Yud, which is another pasuk about the comparison between Israel and Eretz Yisrael and Egypt. And there Rashi cites our very pasuk. And there Rashi says, which is better when you do two projects? Which is better? Which one do you embark on first? Says Rashi, another principle, as it were. And Rashi says the first project you build is what you're setting out to do. You build your perfect project. If you then do a second project, that's when you use the leftovers and you sort of have to create an inferior project. Says Rashi, why is Chevron older than Son in Mitzrayim? Clearly, because Chum wanted to build a better project for his younger son Canaan than his older son Mitzrayim, and therefore he gave Canaan the choicest area, and then he gave Mitzrayim the second best area. So this time he's translating the pasuk literally. Chevron was developed 7 years before Egypt, and the pasuk is saying it's remarkable. Canaan, the younger son, got something before the older brother Mitzrayim, clearly because Chum favored Canaan over Mitzrayim, and Chevron is much better than Mitzrayim. So this time Rashi translates the pasuk literally. Very strange, right? Are you with me? Is everyone following me? That Rashi there in a different pasuk cites our pasuk. He references back to it. And he says this time round, the pasuk is how we would translate it literally. It's saying that Sion is built 7 years after Chevron because clearly Chacham chooses the better project for his younger son, and for Chevron is the better project, and Sion Mitzrayim is the later brother. Then he finishes off in the Gemara and Tosafot. It gives a different explanation. And then he quotes the explanation he said earlier, the explanation that we just read in our pasuk. Okay, so just to summarize, all I'm pointing out is two things here. We have a pasuk which any one of us would translate as Chevron was built 7 years before Egypt, and Rashi in one place gives what we would say is a midrashic reading, but it does technically read into the words. You can't catch Rashi. Rashi knows his Hebrew. You can't catch him. There's nothing illegitimate about reading it that way. It's a reasonable translation, albeit a very, very unusual one, driven by what we would say is a very unusual question. Why would he build for his younger son? I don't know. There's all sorts of reasons why he built for your younger son over the older son. I don't know what the answer is. I don't know. But Rashi is bothered by that. And then the same Rashi, 10 sedras later, cites the same pasuk and then gives what we would call the simpler explanation. And this time says, evidently he favors his younger son. And that's how it's praising Eretz Yisrael. The fact that he gave his younger son first, that evidently he got the better deal. Yeah. They contradict each other in the sense of the translation of the pasuk, and they also contradict each other in the sense of the reasonableness. The first Rashi assumes it's unreasonable that the younger son would get ahead of the older son. Second Rashi says, no, you see from the very fact that the younger son gets ahead of the older son that this is better property, and the first projects are better than the second project. The second project is the leftovers. You choose your prime real estate to develop first, and then you develop your leftover piece of real estate.
Rashi being consistent with the only part of the Torah where the younger is always favored.
Yeah, also an interesting point. Younger's there's a pattern in Torah, but younger. Is this what you're going to say? Also, yeah, very nice point. Yeah, absolutely. And Yishmael and Yitzchak and Esav and Yaakov again and again, a pattern of the younger being favored. Yeah, okay. So I'm sort of surrendering over here in the sense that if you look in the super commentaries on Rashi, of course they pick up on this. Of course there's discussion around this. I'm simply trying to say there's a lot that we don't know about explanation. I want to finish off with one last source before we run out of time. Forgive me. And then I want to we'll have to finish. All I've said so far basically is that Rashi is Pshat. He launches the Pshat revolution, at least in the Ashkenazi world. His successors go much further than him. Rashi is in many ways still engaged in some sort of midrashic reason, but is much more concerned about Pshat than the earlier ones. And even if everyone doesn't like my point that he's literally opening that can of worms, he's definitely setting a precedent to give more weighting to Pshat, which seems to trigger the Pshat revolution. All I want to do now is just cite from Rashi's grandson, and with this we'll finish. There's a very famous quote. This is the bottom page 1 over to the top of page 2 in source 6, in which the Rashbam comments on his own methodology. And unfortunately, the time available, I'm going to translate it I'm going to summarize it outside. He says a number of points. He says, first of all, listen and understand. Yaskilu v'yovinu ove seichel. Listen and understand, reason and understand those who love reason. So he's aware that he's pushing a reason-driven agenda, something driven by reasonableness. And then he says, our sages taught us that ein mikra yotzei midei pshuto, because the main purpose of Torah is to teach us medrash and halacha. And all of that is a massive expansion on the length of the Torah, using the principles of interpretation, the 13 principles of Rabbi Shmuel, the 32 principles of Rabbi Yossi HaGlili, all the midrashic tools at work. So the main bulk of the Torah is to teach us ethical ideas, philosophical ideas, halachic ideas, and the only way you can draw that out of Torah, you don't see that in Torah Shebechsav. Torah Shebechsav, you just see stories and a few legal things. The whole flourishing of Torah is by using the tools of Medrash. And that is certainly the main point of the Torah. Nonetheless, and he says, the early authorities were Chassidim. They were righteous individuals who engaged in learning Torah on that level. However, because that was their focus, they were interested in midrashic ideas, philosophical, theological ideas, practical halacha, and expanding and drawing out of Torah all these principles. Because of that, they didn't focus on Peshat. We don't find in lots of Talmud and Medrash much issue with Peshat. Why? Because that's not what they chose to focus on. They wanted to focus on what the core of the Torah is about. However, because of that, there's not much of them Peshat. And therefore, that leaves for us space to learn Peshat. And we don't need to worry about differing with them, because we're doing a different genre. They were doing the expansion of Torah using the midrashic tools of Agadata and Halacha. I'm trying to do Peshat, and I'm not conflicting with Chazal because they simply didn't do that much of it. And he brings various sources in which the sages, Chazal themselves, acknowledge they're not particularly interested in focusing on Peshat. Who does he cite as the permission to do this? My grandfather, Rabbi Shlomo, the third line in Rashi, who enlightened the eyes of the exile, and he puts his focus on explaining the Pesukim in line with Peshat. And therefore, I too will follow him in doing this. And then he carries on. He says, I argued with my grandfather. And I said to grandfather, you didn't go far enough in Peshat. You could have gone further. Now that you've opened our eyes to the concept of Peshat, you could have gone further. And he says, my grandfather told me, you're right. I did stage 1. There's a stage 2 out there, which I didn't do. And if I had time, I would now do stage 2. We're right for another level of learning Peshat. This is what the Holy Rashbam quotes from his incredible grandfather. He says, you have to understand there's another genre there. My grandfather opened our eyes to this way of learning, and now there's a stage 2, and he was comfortable with me doing the stage 2. He said, you're right, if I had time, I would do a stage 2. I'm not, again, this is often misquoted as Rashi regrets what he did or would have rewritten his commentary. He doesn't say that. He says explicitly, I would have written other explanations. There's another level of learning. And this, says the Rashbam, is what I'm doing. And now the last words. He said, I am explaining the Torah, the last words in bold, according to the new Pshatim that are innovated every day. And that's what I'm doing is innovative. This is new, and this is appropriate to do because it's a new genre of Torah. It's not what Chazal were interested in. Chazal had other pursuits. Rashi, my grandfather, opened up this way of thinking. But there's a stage 2 to go. And I discussed it with his grandpa, and he agreed with me that there was a stage 2, just that wasn't what he did in his lifetime. So with that, we have concluded, Baruch Hashem, at long last, our Baruch Hashem. We can carry on, but I was desperate to get there today. I had to dash off, forgive me, to my Gemara. But I hope anyway that's a fitting conclusion to Rashi. And I'm open to suggestions for the next mini series. I wish everyone a good day, good morning. Thank you so much also for everyone who's joined.